Blossoming Faith, Proclaiming Grace, the Lily Podcast sharing radical testimonies. Hi, I'm your host, Asia.
All right, so we are here with my brother Jonathan, and this is going to be the first time that even I hear his testimony in full. So I am super excited. How are you feeling?
Oh, I'm like really excited to be here. I feel like everybody says that coming in.
Yeah.
But it's unique for me because the first time I've been able to, share on video and sit down and somebody asks me kind of those questions when normally I'm the one used to just proactively sharing.
Right.
Like, hey, have you man, let me tell you, my story, you know. So, to kind of be on the other side of that, getting the questions instead of being the one to engage, it's going to be a little different for me,
Yeah. Okay. So how long have you been saved now?
Ooh, there's I think 2012 was a significant point where I believe that's kind of where I had my encounter with God that really shifted and changed directions for the course of my life. And so that's what, 8 plus 3.
Almost 11?
Yeah.
Yeah, a little
11 years. Yeah.
Okay. So can you start start by telling us what your life was like before you met Christ? And you can pick up wherever you want.
Wherever I want on the timeline, the
yeah.
spectrum. Okay, so and upon inception, I'm just kidding, man, like, where can I start? So before I was saved, I was one of those guys that always thought I was a really nice, kind person. Like, man, my family loved me. Friends, I was like that guy that was always in every kind of clique, that knew somebody from every kind of group, and kind of like almost that chameleon type of vibe. Like, I mean, you just blend in wherever you go, man. You get along with people, like say a joke, make them laugh. I mean, get along, and so there was never really a specific group. I kind of just blended in and was always like that person to, man, I like to make friends and meet new people.
Right.
So, and I was always friendly. So, when I was growing up, I was in different groups. So different groups introduce you to different things, and so I got into, experimenting with drugs at one point, with weed. I had friends that were doing LSD.
How old were you when that was happening?
Oh man, I was probably getting into high school.
Okay.
Amazing how just each part of school just introduces you to different things.
Yeah.
I was when I was younger than that, I was very violent, elementary school, middle school, getting into fights very often, very aggressive.
That's interesting. God changed you, because I would never have guessed.
Yeah, that's what everybody says. I was so bad. I remember, and this is what hits the most for me, is that, man, I literally abandoned my mother while she was close to death. I was so consumed with just my relationship with my girlfriend at the time, and man, I was just so angry and bitter at her, because she would make so many changes in my life, and I was like, man, you just doing things you're taking me out of school so I can be away from my friends, moving me back and forth, and excuse me, and you're trying to take me away from my girlfriend. It was a lot. So I had a lot of bitterness and resentment harbored up, and even growing up without a father, my dad was in jail for 5 years. He cheated on my mom. I would hear stories about that. I was in the back seat of his car when he got caught. There was helicopters shining lights on his car,
wow.
Get up with your hands up, that kind of scenario. So there was a moment I even almost went to foster care because they couldn't contact my mother. This was in and so luckily my grandmother answered, and that foster care service, whatever, was able to get me connected with her. So almost went into the whole adoption system.
That's crazy.
But yeah, I just had that unforgiveness towards my father, bitterness towards my mother, and just a little more in detail. So what really happened and kind of brought me to a place where I had my encounter with God is that actually I got kicked out of my home, right? So when I was about 15 or 16, my mother sent me away. And because I was just so much like that point where she was pregnant, and she was on blood thinners. There was multiple times where like she was just very, very close to death. And I didn't have a care in the world. I was like, forget you. I just want to be with my girl. I don't want to smoke weed. I want to go to parties. And I didn't really love her. I didn't honor her.
Yeah.
And to this day, I'm like, I do my best to show her that love and affection, because it was just such a terrible thing, that I did, and how I treated her, cursing her behind her back, and because she was right in switching me, making me switch schools. I moved around a lot as a kid, in South Florida. I spent time in Hollywood, Boca, Boynton Beach, West Palm. Before that, I was born in Springfield, Missouri. And then when my mom sent me away, I was sent to live with my dad in Puerto Rico. This was long after he was in jail. Got out, became a successful businessman, who owns real estate in Puerto Rico.
Was your mom moving you around because you were getting into trouble?
Yes. Well, she kind of found out, that I was, experimenting with drugs and the crowd I was hanging out with. So she was doing her best to kind of keep me out of those situations. I lived in good neighborhoods. So she was really great in being mindful of that. But I was like, man, you're trying to control me. And like, I was like, I got to break out of this cage, and do what I want. And it was just a lot of bitterness. It just accumulated over time. And a lot of that came from maybe just not also being without a father, and maybe things that my mother could have said differently, that maybe triggered my responses. Like, so it's, that's, I don't know if that makes sense, but.
No, it makes sense. It makes sense. So there was like trouble in your background when you were young. And then how would you say you encountered Christ?
Well, man, when I encountered God, it was when I got sent to Puerto Rico to live with my father. And he actually told me that he had become a Christian. So all my life I grew up in a Christian household. Like, my mom would take me to church. My grandfather was a pastor. He actually ran and started and was the founder of a prominent rehab center that's Christian-based in the Dominican Republic. First one ever to be like basically approved by the government, like certified. And a lot of people created their own after being in his program that he kind of raised up. So he was he was a pillar, He was the one that would interject, in my life and just say, hey, Jonathan, like, hey, this is going on, and you're treating your mother this way. Like, you need to basically self-reflect.
And this is your mom's dad?
This is my mom's dad, yeah.
Okay.
And I remember, it's so funny, like, it got real bad one point, right? I think I was like, intentionally failing school. Like, I would have skipped classes, stay home, lie to my mother about where I was, and occasionally take her car middle of the night without telling her. And he came down, and before he came down, he actually wrote me this letter, and I still have it, and it was basically about like living right before God and honoring your mom. So those were like literally, implanted in me at a very young age, just how important that is. And I remember he came in to visit, and he told me, hey, Jonathan, he gave me this long talk. My grandpa grew up in Brooklyn. He was born in Manhattan. So he had that New York accent. He'd call movies pictures, and
wow.
He taught me about goulash and like just stuff like that. And I loved him. He was the man of God in my life that was that example of, man, this is what it looks like, man, praying, being faithful, doing the work of God, and what he understood what that was.
Right.
And man, it was like, man, I really had a lot of respect for him and the wisdom he had. So anyways, he comes and visits me and he says, "Hey, Jonathan," after giving this long conversation, basically guys finds out that I'm smoking weed. He says, "Hey, Jonathan, like, hey man, if it don't feel right, it ain't tight." And I'm like, "All right, bet. You know, it ain't tight." And he's like, "Hey man," and so he gave me this bracelet, and it was a silver bracelet. And hey man, when you look at this, I want you to remember that. He said. Literally, like a couple days later, I go back to smoking weed. Tell me how the bracelet just falls up and I never find it again. I still don't know where it is to this day. I try to find one similar to it, and literally it just fell off. I didn't even remember it falling off. So, and every time I would like see him and I would look at my wrist, I'm like, man, like it's gone. He probably knows that I messed up. And so I would have like that conviction because, man, we kind of made this promise.
Right.
So those are like those little stories that I remember looking back and kind of how I was and how he was there and being that example. But I mentioned how I grew up in that Christian home. But I went to a Trinity Lutheran school.
Yeah.
When I was in middle school. I got kicked out of that school after being there 6th and 7th grade. And then I moved to a new school. It was like in the hood. It was like the hood. I'm talking about, it was like a D school. I went from like a BA school to going to this D school in the hood with like Crips and Bloods, people getting shot and stabbed.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm like, I come from a school. It's like literally mostly like, I was like the only Hispanic dude. And there was like 2 black dudes. And they were both my best friends.
Culture shock.
Like, I was like, yo, okay, I didn't know what was going on. So I'm just being myself. I'm making the class laugh, you know. And I'm doing my thing. And literally, the assistant principal comes at the end of the class, and he has a box of donuts, and he starts giving them out. And he gives me a powdered donut. So this dude that's next to me, I forgot his name, he ends up, I guess I make some jokes, and like I crack on him a little bit. And he comes to me after class, and he's like, and I don't know, he just talks to me, and I don't know why, but I'm led to like, wave my jelly powdered donut in front of him, and the powder like literally bounces off the donut and onto his shirt. Yo, after that moment, that kid grabbed my shirt. We started tussling, and then I put him on the ground quick because I knew judo. And I was like, "Hey man, I'm chill, man. I'm not here for this. Like I'm not trying to fight you. I should have just kept going, just like ended it, but because I had art class with him, like the next class, and now everybody's like instigating. He's like, "Yo, white boy, put you down. You gonna let him do that?" And I'm like, "Yo, like what is going on right now?" This guy, he's literally red, and he's like moving tables, and I'm like backing up. I'm like, "Yo, what am I gonna do in this situation?" And I was scared. I was a little bit of punk back then. You know, I was a fighter, but then like. This guy was just crazy. He just looked crazy.
Yeah.
And, you know, he starts walking up to me, and then I trip, and I hit my head on a sink.
Oh, man.
And then I'm under the sink, and next thing you know, he's wailing on me. He got like 2 licks in. Next thing you know, I have braces, so I'm bleeding, right? So, of course, it looks worse than it actually was. Yeah. And then I'm before the class, or the, you know, principal or whatever, the security puts me before the class and, like, explains what happens to the teacher, or the teacher explains, and then they pull me out. But I'm like there in front of the class all bloody because I had braces, you know. So, but I did lose that fight. You know, I kind of won the first one, but then the second one, it was over for me. Oh my goodness. But that's a little bit about how I was before. You know, just to give you a little more more details. You know, I was here antagonizing people with powdered donuts. You know, I was here getting, you know, in a Lutheran school, get kicked out. And actually, in Puerto Rico, that's when I had went to a Christian school, a Southern Baptist Christian school. So listen, Christian-y stuff all over the place, basically.
So what exactly ended up happening where your mom was like, okay, you need to go?
Man, I remember this one time I was so mad. It was like 12 a.m. and we were just arguing at the top of our lungs. And I grabbed my phone and I throw it at this window on the 2nd floor, and it bangs really loud. And this neighbor, he comes out, he's stomping. I promise, he was probably Puerto Rican. I'm Puerto Rican, so I can identify other Puerto Ricans. He comes down, he starts yelling. He's like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I'm like, I'm literally about to like pee my pants because this guy was like, he was livid, grown man,
Yes.
you know that grown man too. And I'm this little Rudy Poo that's like 15, 16 years old, you know. So I'm here like and that moment like marked me because I was like, man, like if a stranger has to come out here and get on me about the way I'm talking to my mom, like this is probably getting bad.
Yeah.
It got worse from there. Ended up my mom, you know, with the pregnancy and some challenges she had there, leaving her there when she was like close to death, like I mentioned, and it got to the point where, hey, you know, like she told me, hey, you know, it's been hard for me and I can't take this anymore. Like I'm gonna send you to live with your father, but for the summer.
They always
Dot,
do
dot,
that.
dot.
My mom did that to me too. Just for this summer. You're just visiting.
But she didn't tell me that. But here's the thing. The summer ended, and she called me and told me, hey, I think it's better if you stay there.
So wait, before your mom sent you away, like I know your dad, he went to prison and got arrested, and then now you live in Florida and he lives in Puerto Rico. Did you guys have a relationship before you went to live with him?
I would actually visit him in jail.
Okay.
So it wasn't like a federal prison. It was like, I remember he had like an orange jumpsuit. Sometimes it changed to like a beige. You know, I guess they had a
system.
You know, a system, or like maybe they had a little wardrobe going on there.
Yeah, the
change.
colors mean things.
Yeah. Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
they
Okay.
do.
So I would visit him, and it was important for my grandmother to, you know, take me, and he wanted to see me. So I actually had this picture of me and him, like, while he's in jail, and I'm like this small, and I'm like, not knowing what's going on. I'm like,
Right.
oh, my dad's here. I'm just visiting my dad. This is his house. Like, let's visit his house. And because you don't understand anything at that age. But now that you mentioned that, talking about my father, I do remember looking for role models a lot. Like, I always had a deep respect for anybody older than me, especially that was a man for some reason. And I was like, man, you're an older man. Like, you have wisdom to share with me. And then my grandfather was also an example of that, but he was all the way in Puerto Rico. So I was like, who's that for me? I remember running to dudes that were like, you know, they were like Nazis. Like, this is like this one guy had like a swastika tattoo. He was like probably like a Satanist. And he just sounded so wise. I was like, oh, just sit and listen to him, and you talk to me about like, man, you know, Hitler, he was a genius. I was like, you know what? That makes sense.
No.
Like it was crazy. You know, the stuff you look for, you know, when you just don't really have anybody in your
when
life
you're
like that.
impressionable like that.
So.
Okay.
I just thought about what I just said. I'm like, wow, why did I do that?
Yeah. Okay, so then your mom sends you away to go live in Puerto Rico, and I'm guessing like at this point with you being a teenager now, you're like reestablishing your relationship with your dad, who is saved at this point.
Yes, and I actually had my girlfriend there, so we were actually trying to do like a long distance thing at one point, and ended up not working out, you know.
Yeah.
And so I'm sorry, your question was that, you know, I moved to Puerto Rico and then what?
Yeah, so I was just saying, like, you're reestablishing the relationship with your father at this point, and he is saved. So, like, with you coming in with, like, I don't want to say, like, a troubled background, but, like, you're kind of trying to figure things out in terms of being a teenager and probably dealing with rebellion. Like, what was the dynamic there, like, with you and your father? And then especially, like, with him being saved, like, how did he kind of pour into you?
Man, he was constantly challenging me. He was like, the music I was listening to. He's like, oh, what are you watching? Like, what are you listening to, man? What are you watching that? What are you listening to that? And I would tell him, I was like, man, what do you know about being Christian? Like, I'm a Christian. I grew up going to Trinity Lutheran.
Really?
You know, I grew up with the grandfather was a pastor, and you grew up Catholic. Like, you just became a Christian. Like, how are you going to tell me? So that was my mindset. I was like, I know better than you. Like, this is kind of what I grew up in. Like, you just discovered this.
Teenager.
So anyway, typical teenager thinking he knows better. And so he would challenge me often. And when I got there, I didn't realize how much unforgiveness, you know, was in my heart. Like, we would bump heads so much. Like, he would try to basically just get me to follow instructions or be obedient, do simple little things. And I was like not having it. I was like, man, why are you why are you putting all these restrictions on me? Like I just got here. Like, And who do you think you are? You know, like, man, you weren't even there. Like, I remember storming out of the house, and I was begging, like, my grandparents, who were, like, 5 minutes from his house, by the way. I was, like, begging them. I was like, can I live with you? Like, I don't want to stay with this man. And I just can't, because we would just bump heads all the time. So I was begging my other grandmother, who lived in San Juan, because I was in Aguadilla. And so this is, like, the capital of Puerto Rico. Oh, no, not San Juan, somewhere else. Anyway, so I was trying to just get out of there, really. I was really trying to get out of there because I just didn't really want to submit, you know, to him and I was like, man, you didn't earn that. You know, you weren't there kind of thing.
It's so funny how similar our, like, testimony in that way.
Really?
Yeah. Okay, so what exactly was, I guess, the turning point? Like, and not even the turning point for, like, you finding Jesus, but maybe in the relationship dynamic between you and your dad. How did that?
It's actually connected.
Okay.
So I was there. It was the end of the summer, right? And at this point, my mom tells me, like, hey, you know, like, whatever. It's August. School's about to start. So now we got to figure out what's next in my mom's head, right? And so she calls me and tells me, like, hey, I think it's better if you stay over there. And I'm, like, super pissed. I'm like, you liar. How dare you do this to me? Like, you said it was only going to be the summer. So that only made things worse for me and, like, made me more bitter and resentful towards my mother on top of whatever was there. So imagine, like, 100% full in resentment and bitterness. Now we had, like, 150% overflowing and very angry. And then my dad adding on top of that, you know, trying to control me too when he just got here. Or I just got here, but he's trying to get in my life now. And but a little background on that, I would actually visit in the summers. So it was kind of like that's how I would visit him in jail. And I think when he was in around 7, that's when he got out. But then going back to where I was, I find out that I'm staying in Puerto Rico. My dad tells me, hey, we're going to this men's retreat in Puerto Rico. I'm like, what is a men's retreat? First of all, everybody speaks Spanish, and I don't know a lick of Spanish. I know how to count and how to say hola, like literally. That's a whole other story in itself. So I get to this men's retreat that I'm forced to go, and I literally have a translator in my ear. And this one guy, his name is Danny, and great guy. And he was fluent, so he was fluent in English and Spanish, so he would translate me all the messages that they would have there, and that they would share. So a couple days or one day in, I'm over it. I'm like in a bunk bed with like this one guy I don't even know, and another dude in another bunk bed I don't even know, and they're over here trying to talk to me about God. I'm like, yo, I already know this. I grew up in this. Like, you're preaching in the choir. So we have like a general session with all the men, and they began to share the gospel. So I heard the gospel like all my life. Like, I went to multiple Christian schools. Like, I went to many churches. You know, grandparents talk about it all the time. But literally, somehow, some way, through a translator, right, with this guy speaking in Spanish, the gospel, somebody translating it to me, and I literally just become overwhelmed by the presence of God to the point where I'm just so broken, and I'm crying and I'm weeping, and I realize, like, wow, like, what have I done? What have I done to my mother? You know, how am I treating my father? Like, how stupid am I to intentionally fail a grade? Like, why am I, like, you know, having, you know, sex out of marriage? Like it all just dawned on me, and I'm like, and I was so heartbroken. I was like, man, I'm so sorry. And sorry,
I have a question. Before this experience, like while you were kind of living in your rebellion, were you conscious of your sin then?
I always thought like it was good to go to church.
Yeah.
And so whenever somebody would invite me to a Bible study, I'd always be like, I would be very respectful. I'm like, man, like somebody says, hey, we're going to stand up and worship. I'm like, okay. You know, I would join in. Like, I wouldn't like kind of give a lot of pushback because I grew up having to respect and honor this because it's like part of these traditional values as my family as a Christian. Like, this is God. You have to honor him. Like, it was so much so that I would be scared to say the name Yahweh because I was like, oh, this is so holy. Like, I can't say Yahweh. Like, it's too holy to say it.
Right.
You know, so I did have that upbringing that made me conscious towards God and conscious towards you know, kind of heaven and hell. You know.
Okay. Okay. So back to the men's retreat. You're in the general session. The presence of the Lord is there. You find yourself crying. What happens next? Like, what was how did it all come together?
So so my dad is there too.
Yeah.
And my dad speaks perfect English. Like, he's not perfect. Like, he got a little accent, Puerto Rican accent. And I think he can read a little better, but he's getting better. He's you can have a full conversation with you.
Okay.
And he's there. And after I have this moment with God, like, I look over and I see him, and we meet each other in the middle. And he's crying, he's weeping, and he literally looks at me. I'll never forget it. He tells me, "And I just want to be your dad." And even to this day, that, like, it moves on me so much, because looking back at it now, I realize that that's literally what God desired, that he wanted to be a father to me. And it was that moment where I was literally reconciled with my natural father and my spiritual father at the same time. Okay. You know?
So at the men's retreat, was that the moment that you decided that you would live for God?
That was where it began.
Okay.
That's where I recognized it, and I would say that that's when I began to be convicted, right? You know, because, you know, there's certain men that, you know, things that men deal with, like, they're, you know, struggling with pornography. You know, maybe they're in a relationship they shouldn't be in. Maybe they have friends that they shouldn't be in, have. So it took about a year for me to realize by myself, because I didn't have anybody telling me this. I was going to church and stuff like that in Puerto Rico, which was a great foundation for me. Ciudad de Salvación in Isabela, Puerto Rico. And through those messages over time and going with my family to church, I realized that, man, there's things I got to let go. So that's when I realized, man, I should stop watching pornography. I probably shouldn't be in the kind of relationships that will get me to have sex before marriage. And I need to change the kind of friendships that I have, or surround myself with people that are going to help me get to where I want to go with my relationship with God.
Right. Okay.
You know?
Okay. So then so my first question, how long would you say that process took, where it's like, I guess you're learning what the standards are, and then you're making these changes. So once you decided, like, okay, things in my life need to change, how long did that take?
For me to realize that things in my life needed to change?
Yeah.
I always say within a year, but it was like in that year that I realized, okay, I need to break up with my girlfriend. Like, because, you know, this isn't helping me get closer to God.
Right.
Like, I need to go to church more, surround myself with people that are pursuing God. Like, I need to honor and respect my father. Like, I need to do better in school. Like, all these things, like, it was just a mind renewal, right? I need to stop smoking weed or experimenting with drugs. Like it was just a mind shift, you know. And it was an interesting time, because that was at the same time I was also making new friends, being in a new place. Like, I got into surfing, I got into spearfishing, and, you know, when surfing is kind of like its own community, right? You get in, because not everybody likes it, so you're going to be around people that like it, and that crowd is few. So if you meet them in school, it's even fewer. So I had one friend who was actually from Florida, right? And great guy, and we would just hang out all the time, you know. And I still, you know him to this day. We still talk every so often. But I was like, man, I need some other relationships that are going to help me get closer to God. And so what do I got to do to get there? Like, let me go to these Bible studies. You know, let me check these out. And that's when I started making those connections.
So remind me again, how old were you when you went to the men's retreat?
When I went to the men's retreat, I was 16.
Okay, and then how long did you stay in Puerto Rico?
I lived there for about 3 years.
Okay, so I'm guessing, like, once you graduated somewhere around there, then you made the decision to move back to Florida?
Oh, that's another story in itself. So I'm unpacking a lot, but after I get saved in Puerto Rico, right? I start going to the church my dad goes to, And as I'm going there, man, I really began to experience the presence of God. I'm like, what is the presence of God? Like, whoa, this is different. Like, I grew up going to church all my life, but now I feel something. Like, now I'm like, now I get, filled with the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
You know, like everybody else in my family got filled with the Holy Spirit, like by speaking in tongues. I didn't for a while, a minute, and they thought I did. They were surprised I didn't after I got it. They're like, "Oh, you've been had this." I was like, "No," and like, I really didn't. So, and this was about a year or so, or 2 years living in Puerto Rico, and I was also introduced to like evangelism. So since I was a surfer, I got into this ministry called Salitre Surf Ministry. So we would basically offer people free surfing lessons on the beach, and we would tell them, hey, if you do these surfing lessons, we'll give you these free surfing lessons if we can share this message with you. So we had this message called the Shaper, right? So, and we were like, oh, the Shaper is God, and we're like a surfboard. Like our surfboard is made, it starts off like this blocky piece of foam, but you got to clean it, you got to mold it, you got to put like this epoxy, you got to polish it, you got to clean it. And then there's the leash that connects you to the board so you don't lose it, and that's the Holy Spirit that connects you to God. And it was pretty cool,
yeah.
You know. It was and we enjoyed that. I did that for some time. I was involved in feeding the homeless. I would went to every Bible study, every church meeting. I tried to help out any way I can, but it got to the point where I was like, man, like. Okay, I'm finding the story now. So I remember the teacher or the pastor of that church, she shared this piece of paper, and she said, hey, what ministry do you want to be a part of? To a group of people, I think like in the youth group on Fridays. And it said, do you want to be part of the ministry of deliverance? Do you want to be a part of the ministry of prophetic ministry? Do you want to be a part of the worship ministry? Do you want to be part of the feeding the homeless? Do you want to be part of the evangelism ministry? And I think disciples ministry. And I literally checked all those boxes except feeding the homeless. So I was like, you know what? I feel like these are the ones I'm targeting. And which feeding the homeless is important. I mean, that's great. There's a lot of great work being done there. But I was like, man, I want to be in worship. I want to, move in the prophetic, whatever that means. I want to do deliverance and evangelize and make disciples. And I remember soon after that, somebody came up to me and literally told me, hey, Jonathan, you're going to receive more than what you asked.
Awesome. Okay, so things are...
Oh, did I answer your question?
You did.
I did?
But it's interesting. I do have a question just for this section. So things are basically progressing where you are. So how'd you... I don't want to say like end up leaving, but how'd you end up back stateside if things were? Sounds like they were.
Yeah, they were
really
going.
well.
They were going great. There was this girl I had met there that I thought I was gonna marry, right? And but it didn't work out that way, and for all the right reasons. I mean, Lord knows. And and I'm married now, and like, listen, she's been sent from God. Okay, That's my baby, my blue baby, blue bean, and but. To answer your question, things were progressing. How did I get to leaving? So things were progressing, but it got to the point. So we would do outreach once a month, every Saturday, and my whole family was a part of it. So this was also the first time I felt like I was part of a family. And what had happened is, my stepmother at the time, my dad's ex-wife actually, and my father, were married, and so they were trying to keep things together, and they were, so they were like, oh, we're going to go to God. We're going to start going to church because we want to make this work for the kids, right? And for themselves. So I had a brother and sister, right, who are younger than me. I'm the oldest. And so this was very different for me because I'm like, come from, basically not having my father, right? And now just growing up with a single mom, and now I'm living in this home with a whole family unit, my mother, father, brother, and sister. I even had this uncle who's actually younger than me. Don't ask me why. He's like a year younger than me. And he became like a brother, and we were both pursuing God together. And so that was the first time I got to really feel like, man, this is home. This is a family. And eventually, we were all part of this ministry evangelizing and going to church together, doing these outings, and it was so fun. Like, I really enjoyed it. It was a great time. But it got to a point after I marked all of those ministries I wanted to be a part of, right? I felt like I was hitting a glass ceiling. I was like, man, I feel like I'm doing the same thing all the time. Like there has to be more, right? And then I receive that word that I didn't really understand, that you're going to receive more than you ask. And so I was like, okay, but I'm feeling this way. Like, I feel like there's more. I don't know how to do it, how to get there. The church started trying this new thing called, we're going to do this thing called houses, right? Because they had cell groups, but we're going to call them houses now. But we're still going to go to church on Sundays. So it was interesting. So I was like, this is exciting. They're teaching me, okay, let's make disciples, right? So they started saying, we're disciples now, and this is your leader. I was like, okay, cool. Yeah. So, it was, I was like, that was something exciting. But then, like, the summer comes around, and then I get into this, like, really bad car accident. I get T-boned. I'm in the fence of this hotel, which there's, like, a whole memorial to it now, because they actually changed the fence into this whole, like, advertising, board. So I like to think that, I contributed to the building of that, And so in the accident, I run through this fence at the Hotel Marriott in Puerto Rico. I get this stop sign lodged in there, and in the side of the passenger side. It was really bad. Then after that, I broke my dad's pool motor.
Were you okay?
And I was okay. Yeah, I got scratched up. The other guy, unfortunately, he had to go to the hospital. He had a neck brace. We were visiting him, making sure he was okay. Small intent behind that was like, we also don't want to get sued. So we wanted to check on him, and we were like, hey man, you okay? You okay? Like, hey man, is everything alright? Is there anything you need? And thankfully he didn't press charges against me.
Were you at fault?
Oh yeah, I ran that stop sign. Sign. It was so bad. I was like, Jesus, I repent. I'm so sorry.
I must have missed it. You said that before.
I didn't say it before. Maybe I said it on purpose. But that was that accident, and then I broke my father's pool motor because he has multiple pools, multiple properties, and rents them out. And I would help him clean the pools, but if you don't do it correctly, you can damage one. So it got to this point where my dad was like, I need a break from you, man. You busting up cars, you breaking pool motors, like, go live with your mom. Go stay with your mom for the summer. The summer. That's the theme here. Always got to be in the summer, right? At least that's what they say. So and then I live with my mom, and I meet these great guys. And one of them was like one of my best friends in high school, and he has a full encounter with God. He told me, like, man, I was in LSD, man, I went to jail. I was running out butt naked, and a canine bit my arm, and then I encountered with Jesus. I was like, whoa, really?
Right.
You love Jesus? I love Jesus. Let's hang out, So we would go around, just preach the gospel, talking to homeless people. It was great. And then he told me about this church, right, that was meeting in the homes. And I was like, that's interesting. I'd love to hear that. He was telling me, man, they're all praying in tongues. They're all on fire and worshiping God. And I was like, that sounds so exciting. I'd love to go. So a couple of weeks went by, and I was like, man, you remember that place you told me about? I want to go. So he told me about, he told me about it. He said, I think they're meeting tonight. Let me call this lady, and let me see if she can come through and pick us up. Because I didn't have a car. I just moved to Florida, or just started visiting, Florida. And so they pick us up, we go, and it was amazing. Like, all these people just worshiping God, like giving their 100%. Because, sometimes when you go to certain churches, like, there's people that are half in, half out. Yeah. You got people sitting down. Yeah. People are, like, just there because I guess I'm just checking it out. I'm dipping my toes in, testing the waters. But, man, these people were all in. They were passionate, zealous. And I'd never seen that before after being in the church I was in for 3 years. And because there was only some people that would go up and dance and sing and worship God. And a lot of people just hang out behind. And I always wondered that. I was like, man, I'm so full of joy when I think about my God and worshiping and loving Him. And I saw that, wow, I'm surrounded by a whole bunch of people that feel the same exact way right now.
Yeah. And
saying the same thing. So it was just so great, and I hung around, and it worked out.
That's good. That's good. So with you finding this house church and you getting reconnected with your high school best friend, what happens once the end of the summer comes?
Oh, so I in the middle of one of the church meetings, right? it was. I'm gonna share another story and then bring it back.
Okay.
But I was in there and I remember this lady gives me $100, right? And it was a check for $100. I was like, and I didn't have a job. I wasn't working. I was like, oh, what am I gonna do with this check? And I didn't want to spend it. I was like, God gave me this $100. All right, so I gotta be careful. I can't just spend it on like food or pizza. And so I just kept it in my wallet. And then a couple days later, I think 2 or 3 days later, I lose my phone, right? Or it breaks or something happens. And I had Sprint at the time, and I go to Sprint, and they tell me, hey, man, like, I'm sorry, man, like I'm trying to get a new phone. They're like, man, but you gotta pay the rest of your phone off. Man, I don't, they said it's gonna cost like $97. I was like, whoa. I was like, whoa, hold on. I got this check.
I got that.
Let me go cash this check. I'll be right back. And then I walk out with a new phone. So, and I looking back, and I was like, man, I needed that because I needed to stay in communication with the people that God was connecting with me in this church, right? And that was the only way. I was like, I needed to ride there to get there. Like, they don't know where I live. Like, it was a lot. So, anyways, going back to me staying, or the whole what happened if with Puerto Rico. So also going in one of those church meetings, that same woman, she tells me, hey, she said, hey, you're going to be back a lot sooner than you think. And I was like, yeah, like maybe like 6 months, like, because at this point I was already registered in the University of Puerto Rico, about to study marketing. And so I'm like, yo, my life's over there, like my dad's business over there. He wants me to be a part of it. I'm a surfer, so I'm like thinking, this was going through my head. And literally, the day of my flight, right, I'm getting ready, my bags are packed, going to the airport that same afternoon. My dad calls me. He's like, oye, Jonathan, that's Jonathan in Spanish, by the way.
Okay.
Jonathan, like, listen, man, I've been thinking that it's going to be best if you stay. And I think you're going to have better opportunities there. And I was like, yo, okay. And what's funny? Before he said that, somebody told me that, your dad is going to speak to you and he's going to give you clear and proper directive. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, oh. And I didn't even argue with him. I was like, okay, papi. Dale. Let's go. And he said, you're going to come, but you're just going to pack your things. And then I'm going to send you back. I'm like, okay, that sounds good. And I came back. I flew to Puerto Rico and came back.
Well, amen. Because I'm like, you're registered in school.
Like,
what happens next?
Exactly.
So, did you end up going to school in Florida, or was it just like, what happened?
Yes. So this was after I graduated high school. I went to an all-Christian school, Carib Christian, the only English school in Puerto Rico, and then I come back. I'm sorry. Ask your question again. It was
college. So you were registered. University of Puerto Rico, and then you decided to stay in Florida. So what happened? Did you end up going to school in Florida?
Yes, I ended up going to school in Florida. I was figuring things out for a little bit. I was like, let me get a job, let me get settled in. I kept going to this church I was going to in the home, and I was looking into getting back into school and registering for school. So I went to Broward Community College. And started working on like my associates, so I could let her go to a university, and so that's what ended up happening with school.
Interesting. What did you study?
So I actually only did 2 years. So I did like a little concentration in finance because I was going to study finance, but later on, the way with my career and how it worked out, I didn't even really need to finish to really have a great career.
Good. I was thinking that. I'm like, well, it worked out now.
Yes, because my dad was right. I did get better opportunities.
Good. Can you tell us about any challenges that you, I guess, encountered on the way, right? So we hear things went great in Puerto Rico. Then you come back to Florida. Things are going great here. You find a friend. We all need a friend. You find this friend who's on fire for the Lord. He introduces you to other people that are on fire for the Lord. So what happens after that? Because it sounds like everything is on the up and up. So is that how it was?
Yeah, let's see. So, man, he connects me with them. I keep going to this church in the home. I get connected to other, young men who later become like my best friends. Julio ends up becoming like this guy in Florida now. I'm in New Jersey. He ends up being my best man. Another one of them ends up being my groomsman, right? So these are people that I met in like 2015 who I kept relationships for, up until now, 2023. So over 8 years of relationship that I believe God placed in my life. And so I just began to connect with other folks. I began to really press in terms of, spending time with them and spending time with the body. And because that's what I feel like I needed. But there was this one point, right, where I remember somebody was talking to me and they told me, hey, man, like, I don't think we really need people teaching us, because Jesus is our teacher. And I was considering that. I was like, oh, really? And so he ends up leaving the church, right? The same person I came in with, and introduced me. And I was like, oh, I don't know. And I was like wrestling. I was like, man, this is my best friend. And then at the same time, but these are these new people that I met. And I was wrestling with that. I was like, man, where do I go? And so eventually I realized that, I'm just going to stay because I need to be connected to God's people and to his body, because I feel like, man, without it, I'd be spiritually dead.
Yeah.
Right. And that I wouldn't do well alone. So I ended up staying and realizing, that's where I needed to be. And that's where I really grew and learned how to pray. That's where I learned how to pray better, pray more effectively. Like, oh, what does a warfare mean? What does it mean, spiritual warfare? What does it mean to intercede and do intercession? So God is looking for intercessors, right? So what does that mean? Like, how do I do that? Learning how to cast out devils. Like, what is that? Is it just praying for somebody, or does something happen while I'm praying for somebody? Like, what does the power of God look like? I began to experience that. I also began to know God and trust God as a father. And he began to bring me to a place of, man, what it is to be his son, and really desire the things that he desires and love people the way he loves people. And understanding that, man, we're all connected. So these people that I had a relationship with, like, man, these are people I can't just easily walk away from, because, man, now they're in my life. And I understand that, man, these relationships are, forever. Like, man, people talk about seeing their family in heaven, right?
Yeah.
What about my brother, who's in the church, that God considers that, hey, like, this is your brother in Christ, in the body of Christ, and that you need to love him, right? You need to love your neighbor as yourself and things of that nature. So I began to put a premium on those things and really put a lot of my time there and really grow into a man of God where I could be strengthened and empowered. And there was another person in Florida who was basically like a father to me. And he was later introduced into my life, and he really, man, he loved me. Like, he just really, really loved me so well. Like, because I was so messed up. Like, for a long time, I was just like struggling with cycles of like, just not overcoming things. And really there were sin in my life, like cycles of, men deal with like masturbation, pornography. So for me, it was a long time having to deal with that and not overcoming that for years. And so what happened is that, man, I was always told that, hey, you don't quit.
Yeah.
You don't quit. You keep going. Like, you're not a failure, right? You got to keep fighting. You need to keep going no matter what. And I'll tell you what, that faithfulness paid off, because I did overcome, right? Because I had an example and I had accountability to tell me that, you know what, if you keep going, you're going to break through. You're going to win. You're going to overcome. And in that part of my life, it was questionable, because I was like, man, I felt mentally unstable. I felt emotionally unstable, spiritually unstable. And I was like, man, I could never take care of a house. I could never be a father. I could never be a husband. I could never be a career person, or, someone with an established career or established finances. Like, there's so many of my areas that were affected by just this area of instability where I just did not break through or overcome, you know. And eventually God did bring that,
So I'm just curious. Do you still keep in contact with your high school friend?
I do. So he actually eventually, after just building relationship with over time, because one thing about him, he's always been on fire and passionate for God, and so what I always did my best to is just maintain that contact and relationship. There were some times where it was in and out,
Yeah.
but there was a time where I felt the need to, "Hey, let me just stay in touch and let me not argue and let me not debate. Like, okay, you want to, because there's a lot of other churches that are doing great things and loving God, and so he wanted to be a part of that. You just do it somewhere else. I'm like, that's cool as long as you're loving God and
Yeah.
serving God. And I ended up getting married, having kids, having an established career, and over time, just continuing to speak with one another. Like I asked him, like, he wanted to lead, and he was very passionate. Like he was starting like a skate ministry. He was very involved in his church, and people looked to him as an example, because he was stable. He was pursuing God. He was on fire. But I asked him, man, like, hey, so who's pouring into you in that way?
Yeah.
Who's leading you in that way? Like, are you seeing that same zeal and passion? Are you seeing that power of God that you so desire in your life, and that you want in others? And he said no. And eventually, and I just invited him to meet a friend of mine down in South Florida. And eventually, like, he realized, man, like, he wanted to be where he saw the power of God. He wanted to be around people that were really going to love him, and in a more intimate and deep way, and give him that accountability. And and so he ended up coming back to that. And now, like, our relationship is better than ever. Like when I see him, I kiss him on his face. We're like, hey man, I love you, man. Like I thank you, because I wouldn't be where I am if you
Without
hadn't
him.
connected me to the relationships that I have. And he was like, he told me, hey man, I'm sorry. He was like, man, I was proud, and man, and you were just trying to help me. And I'm like, man, and he said thank you. So, and so sometimes we're quick to like burn these bridges,
Yeah.
just because we don't agree on something. But hey, like at the end of the day, it's still your brother. It's still your sister. It's still a relationship, and God isn't about burning bridges. He's really about reconciling people back to Himself.
Yeah. And plus, when you have that, like the end result of someone being or coming back and even being able to say, like, oh, I'm sorry, or recognize their pride in that way, it's like it makes everything else worth it. You keeping that bridge established and you going out of your way and being annoyed and holding your tongue, it all becomes worth it.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
How would you say your relationship with Christ affects your life now in terms of relationships or work or even your marriage and your home? Like, how is Christ intertwined in other areas of your life?
Oh man, it's I've learned to be completely dependent, and still learning to be completely dependent on God. And before getting into that, I just want to mention something else. Like, even though he came back, it didn't mean that it was better, right? Or it was because, like, oh, we're better than someone else, or
Yeah.
better than another church, right? It was because the love that he felt through me, right? He also saw in the people that I had relationships with, and he just wanted to be closer to that, right? And so sometimes we just want to be loved.
Yes.
Like,
Well, I think we
there's
all
love.
want to be.
We like, and that's a big part of my testimony. People just love me so well, and I was told that, hey, if you just stay, you're never gonna lose my love. No matter how many times you mess up, how many times you fail, no matter how many setbacks you have, which were many.
Yeah.
Like, man, I was still loved, right? Like I wasn't denied a phone call. I wasn't denied a visit to the house. Like I wasn't denied dinner, like a dinner or a seat at the table. Like never, you know.
Amen.
But to answer your question about I was talking about needing Christ, and how because you mentioned being intertwined, and how God is intertwined in different parts of my life. And so I eventually got married, right? Thank God, right? I was listen, I needed a wife, okay? I definitely needed
And
a
he
wife.
got a great one.
I listen.
Yes.
Yes, she's so wonderful. She's amazing. She brings me so much joy, and it's amazing because when you become a husband, I was married. I got married March 5th, 2022, and it was amazing how the things also lined up even going up to that, because I had a great job. I was an account manager for a lending company, and making good money, but I needed something more stable because it was sales, right? So I was asking God, like, Lord, um, Lord, I want something more stable. Can you help me find something more stable, because I want this for my family. And literally, I get a job. Sorry, let me rewind. So I start the process for an interview, and the interview takes forever. And basically, I have my final interview like the week before I get married. And literally, in that same week, I think it's like 3 or 4 days before my actual wedding date, I get a call from American Express. They tell me, hey, we'd like you to work for us, and my salary was
Right on
significantly
time.
more, and it was everything that I needed and asked for. And I was just thanking God. I was like, wow. And even before that, like my wife, she was working in a restaurant, right? She was working at now Tyrese Table, right, in over in Morristown, and check it out. And she wanted to get out of the restaurant, but like find something else. So I referred her to that company before I left, and I actually got her into the company, right? And so she did great in the interview, killed it, and ended up getting the job there, right? Working remote, also I work remote, and her salary probably like quadrupled, and later even got promoted. So it was
That's
amazing
awesome.
just seeing God move, and even leading up to that, God was giving me reassurance and saying, hey, God is going to provide for your wife, right? That job is going to come, and God is going to bring you financial stability. These are things I heard before all of this happened, like probably like 6 months, or something or so before that. And because I'm here getting married, I'm like, man, I want to get things together. I want to be prepare a home for my
Yeah.
wife, and have this stable income. So those are all things that were important to me. Um, and even as I'm sharing that, like there was because this is kind of connected. Excuse me. That I was at a conference, and I remember this was really where I felt like I was the lowest of the low before I was married, before I got this job, before I got these beautiful words from God. Um, Somebody called me up, and there was a few people that were sharing with me that they felt God wanted to say something to me about something. And in this point, like I said, I felt like I was in the lowest of the low. I felt like complete failure. I had this terrible mentality. It was probably coupled with depression, coupled with just feeling like a failure, where I wasn't really excelling. I mean, I just recently like had to stop going to these classes because I wasn't doing well in the university. I continue to have these cycles of sin in my life, where I kept going back to pornography and all this stuff, and I just didn't. I was just wasn't winning. I was like, man, like I felt like a failure. And and so I just felt so bad, and ashamed, right? I had a man, that shame, that condemnation is so real, and it can really consume you. Like I was just so overwhelmed by it, and it's amazing because even when you're in that, it makes you want to distance yourself from people and relationships that are going to help you essentially get to God and be better.
Yeah.
So I remember just hiding and just like distancing myself, and keeping things to myself out of pride, really, because I was really being self-preserving, because I thought, oh, woe is me, my shame is so great, like nobody will understand, like when I really need, if I would have just maybe talked to somebody, or if I would have lived in the light a little more
Yeah.
and talked about my struggles, like I could have gotten the help I needed. But I was so proud, I kept it to myself, right? But anyways, I'm at this conference, and man, it was the most beautiful thing. I get prayer. They tell me that, hey, God is going to, man, that he said, God sees that you're faithful. I'm like, what in the world? What do you mean faithful? Like, I just, I'm this raggedy, like, I'm like the worst of the worst. Like, I'm dirt. Like, I'm like, I felt terrible. And And they said things like faithfulness. They said, hey, anything that is in the Father's house is yours, right? They told me that, and God is bringing you out of the wilderness, right? God is bringing you financial stability, and you're going to know him as a father, and in a deeper way. And I was like, what? So I don't know. I was just crying. I was broken, and it was amazing because I got all this encouragement, right? And all of these beautiful words that were from God that these people felt led to share with me that were from God. And it was in the worst time. Like, it was where I felt like I was in the lowest of the low, like that I couldn't overcome, I couldn't win, and I wasn't growing in my relationship with God, you know. So, and soon after that, that's when I felt this great strength, like, you know what, I can do this, and because some of the reasons, just to give you understanding, like my grandfather dealt with addiction. Like my grandfather was addicted to heroin. At a late age, when in his late 40s, he went to this ministry ran by David Wilkerson called Teen Challenge in New York City, and ended up basically turning his life around and giving his life to God. So that's in my family, that addiction, right?
Yeah.
So people say they're addicted and stuff like that, but I was literally like, okay, I'm gonna go, by myself, and I'm gonna go be in a hotel for 3 days, right? I'm gonna, I'm just gonna be by myself, with my computer, doing, watching pornography, like literally, and it would just, and I also looking back, like, I don't know if you know, but my grandmother, she actually dealt with some form of mental illness. So she dealt with depression. She actually had a schizophrenic episode, right, in an airport, and so a lot of the things in my behaviors, right, some of the forms of behavior that you'll see in schizophrenia is a disorganized behavior, right? So very impulsive, like I got to do this. I'm pacing back and forth. You're making weird facial expressions, and people think if anybody hears this, you'd be like, yo, you crazy. I was crazy. Like I was literally, dealing with like craziness, like stuff that you don't really see around like that, but it was a form of schizophrenia. And that thing had me bound. It had me bound. So I would be super impulsive, right? Not really thinking about my actions. And but God gives us a self-control, right?
Yeah.
But then again, if you want that breakthrough and to overcome those things, you got to be able to either talk to somebody, you got to let people know what's going on, so you can receive that prayer and that help you're looking for, which I didn't do for a long time, right? And but fast forward, I get these words, and out of nowhere, I get this strength, and man, like, you know what? I'm going to talk to somebody. You know what? I'm going to tell somebody what's happening. Like, I'm going to do whatever it takes. Like, I don't care if I look crazy. I don't care if how I look or how people perceive me. I just know that I need help because I need God.
Yeah.
And I felt there was this grace to just overcome these things and fight these things and with great strength. And so I found myself like, man, I'm overcoming these things that I wasn't overcoming for a long time. And I ended up out of nowhere getting this new job, right, as an account manager. Like, whoa, after kind of having these dead-end jobs for the longest time, I'm like here at 24, 25 years old. I'm like, what in the world? Like, I can't work at Sprint and T-Mobile for like, the rest of my life. Like, they're great, but I was working in the retail. Like, I was the guy that like, takes your payments,
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to do that. I'll retire there. But anyway, so I get this job and, things just open up, after I get this word from God, like in my lowest point. Man, God still, he picked me up, he restored me, he gave me the strength to overcome. And I remember somebody told me, one of the things they said, he said, you're going to be able to connect the dots. I feel like sometimes in our walk in our walk as Christians, like we get all these pieces of information, right? And some of them we don't fully understand. Like, oh, people talk about their experiences with God. People talk about, hey, these are kind of like these little nuggets and keys and, ways that, man, you can get closer to God. But sometimes you don't really understand it or how to really apply it to your life. And it was like that in a few areas of my life, listen, there was people that were trying their best to make it practical, but I would just be like, I would just overthink it. I would just be in my head so much about it. I'm like, okay, if I'm made closer to God, that means I got to read my Bible every day. I got to pray every day. I got to spend at least 1 hour praying every day. I got to spend like a couple hours reading this Bible every day. That means I can't be distracted. That means I probably can't work. Maybe I should call out of work just so I can pray.
More complicated.
Like maybe listen. Like I gotta fast. Like it's and these are all important. But I was overcomplicating it. I was like, okay, let me just find time to pray today, even if it's like 30 minutes. Maybe it's like a quick break at work, like 15 minutes, like just intentional time, or maybe it's just like, okay, let me just read a chapter a day. Instead of feeling like I gotta do a whole research paper on the Bible.
Right. Do what you're able.
And so I got this word from God, and it just, man, they said you're gonna connect the dots, and it was amazing because that literally happened. Like walking with Christ has never become more simple. And it's now going back to what you're saying, how it's intertwined. Like, man, like my life is completely dependent on God. Like I have before I was married, my wife had a son who's 8 years old, right? So I'm becoming a husband, right, and a father at the same time. I don't know how to do none of these things. So it was really depending on the Lord. Okay, how am I going to be able to, be a father to someone that wasn't first my own, right? Who's becoming, and he eventually started calling me, daddy. He started, calling me dad, and we started building that relationship. But I really needed to lean on God to be able to win his heart. Yeah. Win my wife's heart so that she can trust me, because she has her own life experiences that may have hindered her from being able to trust people in general. Right. Maybe people did her dirty, let her down, right? And so trusting God to be able to be the father you need to be the husband you need to be, and going to God in prayer that, God, I need your strength to be made perfect in my weakness. Like, I need your help, and I need to trust you in this process, right? And that's, and a lot of the journey has been just that. I'm nothing. I need you, and please help me.
It's awesome. So just considering your testimony in its fullness and, even what's still happening, the testimony that's still being created.
Yes.
What advice would you have for people that can identify with certain points of your testimony? And I guess, when you go to answer that, maybe, point out certain things, yeah.
One thing I could say to somebody that would help them, in their relationship with the Lord.
Right.
Yeah. Man, I just don't be afraid to be completely dependent on God. Don't be afraid to be completely transparent with the people leading you, because if people don't know what's going on, no one's going to know how to help you. And the more that you and I like this, and I'll refer to it as living in the light. If you're in the dark, you're in the shadows, you're keeping things to yourself, your struggles, hiding in shame, right? But when you're in the light, you're transparent, you're open, right? And there's a level of freedom that God gives us to be able to do that. It may be hard because, in America, we have a very independent mentality that we have to do things on our own. But it's so contrary to the Word of God. It's so contrary to how God builds and, strengthens his people, because it's based off a community. It's based off your relationship with others who are going to teach you, lead you, give you that accountability that you need to really stay focused on what you said you were going to do. If you said you're going to serve God, hey, be accountable to the people that are going to help you get there, right? Because what you need them.
Yeah.
I realize that I'm such a needy person that I do need others to really help me in my walk with God, because it's something that I can't do by myself. What if I'm having an issue in my marriage? I'm part of the issue. Me being by myself isn't going to help me resolve this, right?
Exactly.
I have a son. I've never been a father before. Who can I talk to about this? Let me talk to another father that I know who loves God, who has a testimony of loving God and raising his children right.
Right.
And so I've had to really just trust on God and lean on him, and don't be afraid to ask God for the impossible. As I remember, I talked about how I was dealing with that depression, schizophrenia, and just kind of these really low places, and how that's been in my family history. There's a point recently where that actually came up again, right? Like just a couple months ago. And I was asking, it was, sorry, not asking, but I would literally be working and I would just be so overcome with like this anxiety and this impulsivity. I remember I would just be pacing in my room, like back and forth, or in my house. And I would randomly feel the need to start spinning in circles. Like I would start rubbing myself, and like I would feel like something's on me. Like, and I just felt like it's the strangest thing, but disorganized behavior, that's an attribute of schizophrenia. And it got so bad at one point, I began to also feel even depressed, like out of nowhere. Like my life's great. I got a great job. I got a beautiful, sexy wife. I have a son, right? And which I'm proud of, who I love, and I have great relationships. Like I got no reason to be sad. Things are great, you know. And but I was feeling so depressed. Like for some reason, I started feeling like, man, like I'm not enough, you know, because there's certain things happening, like things that could be better, right? Like things with just how do I explain it? Things where I felt like I was falling short, so I was focusing on myself a lot.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, I'm really not good enough. Like I just felt like I'm not good enough, and there's not enough in me to be able to overcome this. So I just felt really low. I would just feel really sad. I remember being in a car with somebody, and I was like, hey man, it would just come over me like that. Like it would just like I would just feel it, and all of a sudden I would just start crying, like randomly. This never happened to me like this before. And I remember being with my wife, and like I was telling her, like I was just quiet, like you put that poker face on because you don't want people to really kind of see, and you're trying to be strong for your wife and family.
Yeah.
And so she asked me one day, hey, is everything okay? Because she saw me kind of like extra serious.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, I feel like I'm not good enough, like, the money, like we struggling to provide here. Like I have a great job, but there's been demanding things in our finances and financial, burdens that really have just been straining, and things outside of my control. So I was like, man, like can't even get my wife an extra pair of sweatpants, it's cold out here, like little things like that, or just being able to want to take care of your wife, or maybe things not going the way with your son. My son was expelled from a school that we paid lots of money to, like a private school, and I was like, man, I feel like things are not in the up and up. This wasn't my experience in Puerto Rico. Like things are, it's tough. And I just felt like, man, I'm the leader of this household, so this is my fault. And I remember I was in my room, and I was in this moment, this episode of like schizophrenia, and I literally take a blanket and I wrap it around my neck and I start choking myself, right? And I'm like, wait, what? So this is a culmination of me feeling depressed, a culmination of me being schizophrenic at the same time, So I'm just acting on my impulses and my thoughts of myself at this moment, and I was like, man, I can't. What am I doing? And I realized, man, I need to go to God like right now, and I need to tell somebody, because I was so ashamed of that. And I was like, man, this is embarrassing. Like I don't want to talk to people about how I'm going crazy. Like, and it really made me be even more vulnerable than I thought I already was. Like I thought, oh man, I'm living the light. I'm telling people about my struggles. Like that's how I got here.
Yeah.
Right. But no, like, Jesus says to be meek and lowly, right? So, okay, for me, that looks like telling somebody I was going crazy, like telling somebody that, hey, I wrapped a blanket around my neck and like I was trying to choke myself. Like, and nobody wants to have those conversations, but it was having that and being told that, hey, you can't just roll over and you need to fight so that you can actually, because you have a family, because you need to serve God, like you're not going to roll over. I was told that.
Yeah.
And through that moment in that conversation, I went to God. I would go to God every day. Every time I would feel it, because it would happen like 5 times a day. I work at home. I couldn't even work for like a couple times. Like I was a couple days. It would literally be days I would just do nothing sometimes because I just felt so unmotivated. I felt so low and full of like this sadness and depression. And I didn't want to do anything and just be still, right? And just be in my thoughts and like, woe is me, self pity, all that. So, God, I remember praying and asking God, Lord, I need your help so that I can overcome. And He gave me this scripture, Isaiah 52. And He told, and so as I was reading it, there's three verses that stood out to me on it. And it says, to dust yourself off,
Yeah.
to loose yourself from the bonds of your neck, and to break into joy. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to do that. So I was like, you know what? I pull these thoughts down and I dust myself off from every thought of schizophrenia, every thought of depression in the name of Jesus. And I loose myself from the bonds of my neck. I command those things to go. I rebuke those things in the name of Jesus. And I rebuke every thought that would try to exalt itself above Christ. And God, I just worship you. I break into joy. I worship you. I praise you, God. You're so good. You're mighty. You can set me free. You set the captive free, God. You are my deliverer. I can call you on my days of trouble because you are where my help comes from. And so doing that, I had to do that like 5 times a day at some point, just so that I wouldn't go crazy. And literally, I remember somebody prayed for me one day as I continued doing that, and I've had a pattern, and it was working. Like, this would go away, right? But it was aggressive. I had to be intentional and persistent, and I couldn't stop. I had to fight it, right? And then one day, someone prayed for me, and I literally felt all of it leave me. Amen. That schizophrenia, that depression, it literally just left me. And after that day, I never dealt with it that way again. Amen. Never. And God literally set me free from schizophrenia and depression.
Amen. So, with you sharing that, I almost feel like I know the answer to my next question.
Really?
But I'm going to ask it anyways. Who do you know God as in your life?
God as in my life? Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. We know He has so many different attributes. He has so many different names.
Yes.
But off the top, like, what is the main thing you know Him as?
The main thing. One thing?
One thing.
One thing?
Well, however many things.
Yeah? Okay. Well, I've known Him as a father. And I feel like that has grown over time. And that we can take it so... we can take that word like so plainly and so make it so common. Yeah. Because, we have the Our Father in Heaven prayer. Mm-hmm. So people will just say it without even really considering or even having the knowledge of God as their Father because it's a form of prayer, right? And some people will only use that as a prayer. So, and I look back and I was like, literally from the day I was saved, right? God showed me that He was my Father when He reconciled me with my natural father. And He said that, oh, I just want to be your father. So that was the beginning, right? And then there came to moments where I was moved from, to Puerto Rico. And then I moved back and I had to trust God. Like, God, I don't know what's happening, but you're my father, so I'm going to trust you in this process, even though I don't understand. I don't barely know these people that I'm around, right? But I believe this is where you want me to be. So I'm going to trust you. You're my father. And then in a place where I'm coming to be married and I need God to provide, right? Or I'm looking for God to bring stability and help me overcome. He sends somebody that helps me, right? He's like a spiritual father. And He teaches me, hey, a man of God doesn't quit. Christians don't quit. And you need to keep fighting, right? So my spiritual father taught me that. And then going back to trusting God as your father, I'm preparing to be married, and God is telling me all these things like, hey, I'm going to bring you stability financially. He provides for me. You're my father, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's even scriptures that say, hey, the birds of the air, they don't have to worry about where they need to lay their head. Mm-hmm. They don't need to worry about where they eat. Literally, they prepare for nothing. They literally just make a nest and just hope everything works out. Yes. And He says, how much better are we? Like, I'm your father. And then going into being married, becoming a father, right? It's and trusting God as a father. When you desire good for your children. Like, even though they do mess up, right? Even though they may get kicked out of school, right? Even though they may not follow your instruction, like, you love them. Yes. Wow, because that's the Father's love. And And also even being a husband, trusting God to be the husband I need to be, trusting God to set me free because I'm His son. Like, He desires for me to do well. Like, He desires for me to be a good father, a good husband. He desires me to not be in bondage with schizophrenia, with depression. He wants me to be free because that's the portion of a son. That's a promise of the son. To have a sound mind is to be a son, right? And knowing that and trusting God to give that to you. And that has been my experience, knowing God as a father, and He is my father, and I'm His son.
Amen. Amen. Well, that's that.
Yes. Woo! Hallelujah.
I want to start by saying thank you so much for listening to the newest episode on the Lily podcast. And I want to invite you, if you are Christian and you have a testimony that you would like to share, please, please, please send us a DM on Instagram at the lily.podcast, and we will get a time set up and we'll discuss how we can get your testimony out to the world. Thank you again so much for your support.